There's a lot happening at the United Nations right now, but the burning question is, can the world mobilize to take the actions needed without the United States playing an important role for the good? Good morning. It's Thursday, September 25th. I'm Diane Sare, and this is the morning update, normally done by Harley Schlanger, who will be back with you tomorrow. So first of all, as he told you yesterday, and you probably have seen, after President Trump gave his speech 2 days ago, he put a very peculiar post up on Truth Social saying that he now understands the reality of the Russia-Ukraine war. The Russian economy is devastated. There are long lines for gasoline. And if Ukraine really moves right now, they can take back all of the territory that they lost during the 3 years of fighting, and that the U.S. isn't going to be supplying weapons, but will be happy to send weapons to Europe if NATO pays for them. So very bizarre message, very delusional. Ukraine is not going to win the war no matter what weapons are sent there. You partly wonder, is Trump bluffing? Is this some peculiar thing? And I'll read you a couple different takes on it. Whatever you want to say about it, it's certainly not very statesman-like, and I don't think it is a comment appropriate to come from the President of the United States. I don't think it's proper for the President of the United States to handle diplomacy through social media posts as opposed to formal letters to other heads of state. And perhaps President Trump picked this up in part because of the spectacular censorship he was subjected to earlier. But nonetheless, I don't think it meets the standard of diplomacy or statecraft. That being said, let me be very clear. I consider the opposition to Trump coming from the leftovers of the Democratic Party, Biden, the No Kings movement, to be even more incompetent than President Trump. That's the problem. But here we go. So Zelensky said that in his speech to the UN General Assembly that it's really irrelevant unless they get together and they unite to shoot down Russian missiles and drones, that there should be a no-fly zone over Ukraine. He blamed Russia for prolonging the war. He said Russia does this with impunity, using its veto power, buying influence, and keeping peace on hold, that Putin fears to sit down with Zelensky. Zelensky is not even the legitimate president. He canceled the elections. He is unconstitutionally in power. And then he said if China really wanted the war to end, China could compel Moscow to end the invasion. So that's frankly delusional. Then on the sidelines, Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with the senior diplomat on the planet, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. I will read for you the Russian readout on this, which, if you understand diplomatese, means they are by no means in agreement. They write, on September 24th, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The heads of the foreign offices exchanged opinions, on the Ukraine crisis settlement as a follow-up to the understandings reached at the Russia-U.S. summit in Anchorage. The parties have reaffirmed mutual interest in the search for peaceful solutions. Sergei Lavrov emphasized our country's, Russia's, readiness to adhere to the line developed by the Russian and U.S. leaders in Alaska, including to coordinate efforts with the U.S. side to remove the root causes of the Ukraine crisis or conflict. The minister stressed the unacceptability of these schemes intended to protract the conflict promoted by Kiev and some European countries, namely a no-fly zone, boots on the ground, and the other sorts of things coming from the foolish European leaders. Lavrov or the readout from Russia went on to say the parties compared their positions on the entire bilateral agenda, including the prospects of restoring their socio-political contacts. They have reaffirmed the importance of using the impetus given by the Russian and US presidents to the process of normalizing bilateral relations. Both parties noted the need for activating efforts to restore regular functioning of their diplomatic missions. The sides have agreed to maintain constructive dialogue between the Russian and US foreign offices. So, okay, despite Trump's wacky post, they're going to keep the dialogue going. That's very useful. Clearly, they don't agree, and I'll come back to more on that in a minute. This is just a report on Saudi Arabia's report on the Arab OIC meeting with President Trump. That what the Saudis say is what they promoted. We don't know what President Trump said or if he agreed or didn't agree with this. Well, we know part of it he doesn't agree with because he made very clear that he doesn't want to recognize a Palestinian state, that he thinks this would be rewarding Hamas for October 7th or something like that. So, according to the Saudis, what they told President Trump is that ending the Israeli war in Gaza is the first step toward achieving a just and lasting peace. They reject the forced displacement of Palestinians, and they want those who have been displaced to be allowed to return. They said there should be an immediate ceasefire that would secure the release of the hostages and enable the delivery of sufficient humanitarian aid, that is 500 to 600 trucks per day, not 50 or 60, as the foundation for a broader peace effort. They emphasize the need for a stabilization roadmap covering the West Bank and Jerusalem's holy sites, while voicing support for reform efforts within the Palestinian Authority. They also backed a reconstruction plan. Previously, Saudi Arabia had backed the Egyptian plan. I don't think they'd feel so keen about the Tony Blair plan, which Trump supposedly is supporting. I don't know. Nothing's been official on that so far. Now, the London Telegraph was very unhappy with President Trump's post, asking, is Trump really now throwing his weight behind Ukraine and a leader he once humiliated in the Oval Office? And they say only up to a point. They credit King Charles and his soft diplomacy, maybe soft but not subtle, I would say, during Trump's visit to the UK with shaping Trump's latest post that Ukraine can still win the war, I guess. What a bunch of hogwash. And they say, but look beyond the headlines, and Trump's statement is a lesson in messaging. Rather than pledging fresh support to Ukraine or loading up action on Russia, Mr. Trump appears to be handing things over to Europe and NATO. There is no suggestion of extra support for Ukraine from the US or that he will punish Moscow further. His only commitment is to keep selling weapons to the allies, hardly a game changer. So that's the British take on Trump's post. Now, Dmitry Rogozin, who is the former head of Russia's space agency and is now a senator in Russia, writes of Trump, the old man is throwing threats at us, provoking us by calling us a paper tiger. Such talk is so unworthy that it is hard to even imagine anything like this coming from the president of a great power until now. The old and restless American man trolls us by saying that a normal military power would have ended such a war in a week. I understand what this madman means by his words. His ideal is Netanyahu, with the monsters in the Israeli general staff who leveled Palestinian cities with their populations to the ground. Rogozin said, he wants us to physically exterminate our Ukrainian kin, even if they behave by the principle, there is a black sheep in every family, unquote. But Moscow won't do that. No, old man, you won't get your wish. We are not your idols from Tel Aviv. Yes, you managed to spill Slavic blood, pitting us against each other. You were lucky to taste Russian blood, but it will be your ruin. You cannot digest it. Rather, we do not deploy our power in such a fashion, unquote. So Rogozin making the point that is Trump taunting us to behave like Netanyahu and just level everything and kill everyone and commit a genocide? We're not going to do that. And indeed, if you look at the figures, which are very high, Ukraine has lost as many as 1.8 million soldiers. The civilian casualties and deaths are exceedingly low because their intention is not to destroy Ukraine and not even to take over all of Ukraine, but to protect the Russian-speaking people, to denazify, demilitarize, not have Ukraine join NATO. And this could have all been done 3 years ago had there actually been an intention for peace, but there was not. So in wrapping up today, I just want to really stress the importance of Lyndon LaRouche as a presidential candidate 8 times and a statesman for embodying a quality that we saw in great American leaders like John Quincy Adams, George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, President Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln. We've had relatively few statesman-like candidates. Even President Ronald Reagan, who made some terrible mistakes in economic policy, but if you watch him speak, particularly his March 23rd, 1983 speech, where he took up Lyndon LaRouche's laser defense policy, called the Strategic Defense Initiative by Reagan, you heard a glimmer of an understanding of what it meant to be a true statesman and to comport oneself with a quality of dignity which would presumably bring out the best in other nations. For example, had we an American statesman as president, well, of course, first of all, we would have already stopped sending weapons to Israel. The genocide would have been halted. The Ukraine-Russia war would not have occurred. But imagine a new president came in. They could announce at the United Nations, we're halting these weapon shipments immediately. We're working with China and Russia, large nations, to insist that the war stops, that nations are guaranteed security and protection, that terrorism is rooted out, that there would be a conference of the largest economies, China, Russia, US, India, probably others would want to join, to basically put this bubble of derivatives held by London and Wall Street through a bankruptcy organization. We'd write off a lot of the debt. We'd return to a fixed exchange system, and we'd return to the kind of relations among nations which John Quincy Adams was calling for and which George Washington had in mind and addressed in his farewell address. This approach is being put forward now by the Chinese. They call it their global governance initiative, but they do not mean global governance in the term of globalization or what King Charles calls global Britain. They simply mean having a standard of respectful relations among perfectly sovereign nations where you respect the interest of the other nations and you search for common areas of benefit, such as fusion research, space exploration, tackling challenging diseases, learning about our biosphere. There's an enormous amount that mankind still does not know, and we would do well to collaborate on understanding our biosphere, our universe, the power of the human mind to make discoveries, and collaborating with our friends around the world from diverse cultures and nations to better the conditions for mankind as a whole.